Sup guys? This is the second part of the Chinese Wiki tier list review, going over the Operation Siren tier list this time. The major difference with the Chapter 14 version and this one is that this tier list is centered around Operation Siren, meta fights, and also the guild boss as well. So again, investment will be taken into account when discussing these ships. I believe they're taking all of Operation Siren into account, which I think is actually a bit of a mistake. Unlike Chapter 14 where the boss fight is not significantly different from the mob fights, and the hardest fights are actually the out of ammo fights, there is a pretty big gap in difficulty as well as strategy between Operation Siren mobs and boss fights. For the most part, I don't think there's even a need to specifically single out Operation Siren mobs when compared to campaign, whereas arbiters and meta bosses are quite a bit different from typical campaign stages. With that being said, let's take a look. The first thing I want to do is highlight this color code, which denotes how tanky a ship is, with the colors at the top being the tankier ships and then the colors at the bottom being not quite as tanky but still tankier than ships that have no color. This is kind of similar to the tank tag for the English community tier list, but they're using it as a tip rather than a justification for the tiering. So for example, if you're tanking with, say, Azuma and she's not reliable enough, then you probably want to go one grade higher, in which case your options are A-Gear, Anchorage, Breast, and Yatsen. Another useful tip can be found in the buffs category, where a dark blue background indicates buffs that go away if the ship is sunk, while light blue buffs will remain even if the ship sinks. In general, flat damage buffs like air raid assistance and Aurora's buff do not persist, while stat changing buffs like Sirius and Baltimore's do persist through death. This time I'm gonna go from top down instead of by whole class because I realized it's probably a better idea given that they tier cross hull. Starting with the SS tier, everything makes sense except Breast, who has the same note as in Chapter 14, which says the best mob tank. You definitely don't need the same level of mob tanking in Operation Siren, so personally I would drop her down a tier. Kronstadt's cross-fleet spread reduction for battleships, as well as her higher damage output, which is very relevant against meta bosses, is more useful than the stuff Breast brings, so I would place Breast right between Kron and Azuma. Helena, of course, will help the most out of any Vanguard if you're not stacked to the gills with ships and equipment. Even if you are, chances are she will give you the highest damage ceiling if you can be bothered to play around her restrictions. She is a lot more useful in Operation Siren because the bosses have much higher HP and sometimes even shields on top. Aurora of course has a very powerful debuff that is sometimes even more potent than Helena, but she is kind of a pain to keep alive and at times you have to change up your fleet a bit to accommodate for her. I think it would be fair to put her a tier lower with Kazagumo and Sirius, who have weaker buffs but are more widely applicable and don't need as much babysitting. Although Kazagumo is probably almost as squishy as Aurora, but from experience I feel like Aurora needs a bit more babysitting, probably just because carriers screen clear indirectly help Kazagumo survive a bit better. The real reason I think that Aurora should be down in S tier though, is found all the way over here on the left side. While I can agree that compared to Chapter 14, destroyers as a whole should be rated a bit lower because there's no concealment, no need for anti-submarine, and more frequent AoE attacks that can just nuke them out of orbit. But I think overall their placement is a little too low. If you played around with Anshan and Changshan against Helena meta, you probably noticed that their damage output just eliminates the need for Aurora, and they're also a bit easier to keep alive. As for Shimakaze, she's definitely not as valuable and easy to use outside of Chapter 14 compared to Plymouth, but if you compare her to the likes of Kazagumo and Harbin, she's definitely at least as good. Against a light armor boss, you're likely to use Anshan's over Harbin, and against a medium and heavy boss, Shimakaze will do much more damage, but Harbin does provide some smokescreen utility. Overall, I would move the Anshans and Shima up to S tier. Shima obviously could be SS on manual, but unlike the Chapter 14 list, they did not add the little note about manual, so I won't consider it. Yudachi could also arguably move up, as I find that she does deal a bit more damage than Harbin, but lacks the smokescreen. There have been meta fights in the past where I chose to use Yudachi over Shimakaze though, just because she had a better time surviving. After that, for the A+ tier, Ryza might be a bit overrated, although her note here says high damage for 30 seconds, which people could interpret as her being good for mobs. But here's a quick tip for you guys tackling Abyss and Arbiter bosses and are struggling to get by. This is not advice for meta bosses. If you're a bit low in levels, it is quite likely that most of your fleets will die before the end of an encounter. Since you get multiple attempts at the boss, you should maximize your damage for the little while that your fleet can survive. For example, you can build a fleet with a ton of preloads and front-loaded damage like torpedo ships with preloads, and something like the Foxes, that can survive for maybe 40 seconds and deal 20 bars to the boss. Or you can, for whatever reason, build a tankier fleet that can maybe survive for 70 seconds, but ends up dealing about maybe 18 bars of damage. This is definitely something you should consider, in particular against the heavy cruiser Arbiter strength, where at 30 seconds remaining, it puts up a huge shield that you have to get through. And it is definitely more efficient to just front-load your damage and move on to the next fleet when it spawns its shield. Something similar happens with the Battleship Arbiter as well, where at 50 seconds it reduces the accuracy of your fleet by 200, so you should burst it as much as you can with your supplementary fleets in the first 40 seconds of the fight. I could probably do a better job explaining this, but we should probably get back on topic. Looking over to the support category, if Bristol is considered on manual, then I think she could deserve this spot, or maybe even higher, but since there is no such note, I would probably drop her down because it's a bit unreliable on auto. In terms of additions, I would add Kawakaze and Sella into this tier. Kawakaze is quite obvious in terms of damage output, and there is no world that Sella should be in the same tier as Belfast. Also, Idol Rune here has a note saying off-tank manual. With that note, her value is easily above that of Drake, but if you're using her like that, then you don't really need to awaken her to 125, and I would say that she is more fitting for A+ in the buffer category. Next up, in the A tier, I'm not sure why Jervis doesn't have the same color code that a lot of similar bulky ships have. Maybe they just forgot. Since Regolo is here, I personally think it would be appropriate to put Wakatsuki and Kitakaze here. While Regolo is tankier than both, which is a bit more relevant than in other places, I think Wakatsuki and Kitakaze does enough damage to be around the same tier, and I think they're both better than Suzuki. In the support area, in terms of fleet value, Baltimore is likely going to be in the same fleet as Northampton almost always, but since Northampton deals higher personal damage and needs to stay alive for her utility, it makes sense to put her higher priority to be uncapped. Aurora's damage contribution will likely be higher than most ships in the A+ tier if you use her with the S and SS tier ships, but you definitely don't need to awaken her to 125, so her placement makes sense if viewed from that lens. Past that, I don't think people who look at tier lists really care anymore. If you're a newer player, perhaps you want to know more about these ships because they're all you have. However, I don't think that the ratings of these ships in these tiers have as much data and scrutiny as the ships in the upper tiers, so the best place to get information on how to make the most out of what you have is probably to ask veteran players. What does a veteran mean, you ask? Well, moving on. I think the carrier section is pretty well thought out. They have notes saying that Implacable is the most flexible and easiest to use, but AVP is almost equal to her against light and medium, and Arc Royal is almost equal against heavy, all of which make total sense. For Operation Siren mobs, I can see an argument for Perseus to be in the same tier as Unicorn, but I'm definitely the last person to complain if she's not. Between Shinano and Haku though, I would probably move Shinano to the left and then Haku down to S, but ahead of Chkalov and Enterprise. Shinano is just clearly better than her, and is the more important of the two to have, as you can somewhat replace Haku with Taiho. For Yorktown's placement, there are a bunch of notes, including New Jersey's cross-fleet buff, support from both Baltimore and Northampton 2, and BF-109G as well as the HVAR planes in terms of equipment requirements. It also says that she can help get around the 20-second shield that some of the Arbiters have. This is the only ship they put this high with all these fleet and equipment conditions, so I sense a little bit of a bias here. But if all those conditions are met, then yeah, she can stay in this tier. Hornet 2, I would probably switch with Independence though. And also, I would move Idol Akagi a bit closer to Impero, but otherwise everything else makes sense. Just a few very minor nitpicks here and there. For battleships, all the URs are going to be in the highest tier, as you would expect. I personally prefer New Jersey over Musashi in my Operation Siren fleets these days, for a couple of reasons. A fleet with Vanguard, Bismarck, and New Jersey can deal with heavy armor a bit better than a fleet with Vanguard, Bismarck, and Musashi can deal with light armor. So there is a tiny bit more flexibility there. My carrier fleet has Shinano and Haku, so heavy armor is pretty much handled. Syncing New Jersey with the other two battleships is also a bit easier, and her cross-fleet buff also helps with fleets that contain Yorktown 2 and Independence. By the way, I'm not saying New Jersey should be rated higher than Musashi, just giving my personal opinion between the two. Musashi's note says highest damage for medium and heavy, which is true, and New Jersey can't quite compare in meta fights, where you can actually be bothered to use a loader on her for sinking. But in Operation Siren, I think the extra damage is not as useful as New Jersey's flexibility for light armor. Just my personal opinion, that does not affect their ordering at all. After that, I personally think that Brunhilde is as good as Hao, and Hood is severely underrated for her ability to help certain main fleet ships get off an extra salvo in boss fights, so I would probably move her up to S tier. Maybe I would move Champagne down to beside Richelieu because, well, you're most likely not going to be using her without bringing Richelieu as well. And the rest of the battleships, I don't have much complaints about. Submarines is kind of pointless min-maxing territory, and the top 3 recommendations look just about fine. That about wraps up the second part of the Chinese Wiki tier list review. I give this one an 8 out of 10, as I have fewer disagreements with it when compared to the Chapter 14 one, most of them just being a 1-tier difference. And also, both the color grade for EHP, as well as the indicators for which buffs remain when a ship sinks, are quite useful. If you can read Chinese, then feel free to check out the original post in the description, which also contains equipment and augment guides. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.